Godward, the podcast. I'm your host, Casey, and we're back at it. I know it's a lot, by the way. I know it's a lot to take in. This is just too much of a fire hose sometimes. All the content and like, you know what? Sometimes you tune into a podcast, you just want the background noise. You just want somebody talking to somebody else about whatever. Which, by the way, I might do in the future. I mean, if anybody ever wants to come on the show, we could do it that way. It would be interesting. I'm up for it. Especially if you've, like, read something and you want to talk about it. Like, that would be solid content, it seems like to me. But until we make those kinds of changes, I think we're still just building the foundation. We're building our peoplehood as, Godwardites or whatever. I have a epigraph, how's that go? Epigraph or something, for this episode on Dostoyevsky's Notes from Underground. And here's the translation, by the way, by Richard Peviar and Larissa Volokonsky. Is by far the best one I've read. I mean, I think these two are like the standard now for all the translations of Dostoevsky. So if you're going to read this, make sure, and it's not that long. It's like a short Dostoevsky. So if you're going to read this one, get that translation. Dostoevsky, in a letter to a friend, once said, "It is not as a child that I believe and confess Jesus Christ. My Hosanna is born of a furnace of doubt." So, kind of amazing. This guy has the very modern, essentially 20th century existentialist sort of Christianity. And that's, to me, part of what makes him so interesting here. But he's also still very capable. In fact, he was among the early capable writers to be able to write the kinds of characters that just plain doubted. And so, you might read Turgenev's Fathers and Sons and you encounter that Bazarov character who's an atheist. And I think, or Voltaire, they would do these atheist characters, but they didn't feel like real people. Whereas in Dostoevsky, he tries to bring them to life. They seem three-dimensional. They have real opinions. They're not cartoon characters. They're legit. They're real. So that's a part of what makes his writing so interesting. Anyway, I have already alluded to my general take on Dostoevsky in previous episodes. Essentially, I read him exactly as Bakhtin encourages people to read him, as the master of dialogism. The way that works is each character is imagined and fully, sympathetically, breathed life into by the author, and then the author just puts these different characters in interaction with one another. So the author, this is all sort of theory, but in theory, the author does not seek to steer their reactions, but only to trace how they would actually interact to the best of his ability, to sort of play out these interactions, which are ideally sort of, representative dynamics, which reflect reality to readers. So if Dostoevsky writes of, an aspiring saint and his atheist brother who has maintained these kind of saintly tendencies of the Christian, but who no longer believes, and the third brother, their nihilist brother, who genuinely seems to have no transcendent aspirations, we, the readers, shouldn't expect Dostoevsky to kind of settle all that for us. It's not about that. It's just let's see what happens when these three guys get into a room together, make some plans together, and have conversation. And so a lot of Dostoevsky is often just talking. I've read all 5 of his major novels, although only Demons and Brothers Karamazov in the last 10 years. In order from best to worst, if you were thinking you wanted to read some Dostoevsky, I would say read Demons first, which is the possessed or the devils, it's sometimes translated. But if you get the Peviar and Volokonsky translation, it's demons. Next best would be Brothers Karamazov, then Crime and Punishment, then The Idiot, and then Raw Youth, or The Adolescent. He also wrote a bunch of novellas and short stories, my favorite of which was called The Double, about a man who encounters his doppelganger. Which is a very modern thing, by the way. Like, I think Poe did this a little bit before Dostoevsky, but you don't see that too much before the 19th century. And then you get these kind of playbacks of it with, like, Borges does a good one in the 20th century, and I'm trying to think of other examples, but it seems like that becomes almost like a trope. So, anyway, my next favorite, unless we sort of include Notes from the Underground as one of these, would be Notes from the Underground, okay, which I'm going to talk about in this episode and in my next episode. It's so good, and like more than that, it's so extremely, like harrowingly relevant in 2020. This book is broken into part 1 and part 2. So that's how I'm going to treat it in these 2 episodes. Part 1 now. So part 1 begins with the voice of the narrator, the first person. So he's going to say I this and I that all the way through this. And the voice is very modern and essentially like kind of, he retains a certain formality in his speech, but like it's informal compared to what you would get if you read things 100 years before that. So this modern sounding narrator is, at least for Dostoevsky, supposedly like representative of a certain sort of very modern man. The kind of man that in Dostoevsky's mind, and I think he's right, kind of couldn't have existed until, I think this book was written in 1864. So like until that time or thereabouts. And here's how it starts. Very famous first paragraph. I'm not going to read the whole first paragraph, but 6 or 8 lines. Quote, I am a sick man. I am a wicked man, an unattractive man. I think my liver hurts. However, I don't know a fig about my sickness, and am not sure what it is that hurts me. I'm not being treated, and never have been, though I respect medicine and doctors. What's more, I am also superstitious in the extreme. Well, at least enough to respect medicine. I'm sufficiently educated not to be superstitious, but I am. No, sir, I refuse to be treated out of wickedness. Now you will certainly not be so good as to understand this. Well, sir, but I understand. What an awesome... I hope you could, honestly reread... you should open the book and read it, or listen to this again. I love so much about this. I love, the weird... it's like no one wants to... It's weird that in fiction there's this thing that happens where... It reminds me of Camus, actually. It reminds me of Camus, the beginning of The Stranger, where this very unlikable narrator guy says, Mom died today. Or maybe it was yesterday. I don't know. I've been busy. It's like, what? How can you be such an idiot, right? Like, how can you be such a jerk, such a sort of person of no sentiment or whatever? And yet, when you read it, it's like, even though you wouldn't want to sit down and be this guy's friend or have coffee with him, you do want to keep reading it. I find that to be kind of a fascinating thing. It's like something different is happening when we read than when we, interact with people. So although I don't want to hang out with the underground man in real life, and I certainly don't aspire to be like him. This is like an anti-hero, true anti-hero. Nevertheless, I can't look away. I want to read it. I am a sick man, he says. I am a wicked man, an unattractive man, right? And something hurts in my liver. And then he goes into this thing about medicine. I respect medicine and doctors, but, it's only because I'm superstitious. And then he's like, but it's not because... You can hear him, it's actually in parentheses. You can hear him try to jump out in front of any criticism that readers might reflect back at him. So he calls them gentlemen all the time. This is his reader that he's imagining in his head. And it's as if he wants to show this potential critic that he's already criticized himself, and so he's 2 steps ahead of you all the time. He never wants to let you get a critical word in about him, right? So in parentheses, I'm sufficiently educated not to be superstitious, but I am. No, sir, I refuse to be treated out of wickedness. And then he says, you, that is you middle-class, conformist, scientist gentleman, you will certainly not be so good as to understand this, but I understand it. And so he tries to, like put himself in a position that's sort of above, like hierarchically, like he knows more than his readers. Man, I love that paragraph. Is it the self-deprecation or the hyper self-consciousness or the way he stays a beat ahead of these gentleman readers all the time? I don't know. It's probably all of this stuff kind of bundled up together in that first-person voice itself. He tells us on page 2 that he is a 40-year-old collegiate assessor, which I take to just be some middle-class, whatever, bureaucratic job, Although part 2, which we'll talk about in the next episode, is basically a big, long story told by the 40-year-old of when he was 24. And, in fact, the entire story taken together seems to work as an explanation, how did he end up like this at age 40? Why is he so, grumpy and contrarian and cranky and insecure at age 40? And it's like he introduces himself with all that crankiness. And if you can follow him and get through part 1, he's then going to tell you a story about something that happened to him when he was 24 that in his mind at least kind of explains and maybe even justifies why he is the way he is at age 40. So this story is so extremely carefully crafted that if you read it closely to the end, even though Dostoevsky doesn't give you an answer exactly to what happened in this guy's life, I think it does successfully force extreme introspection on readers. And the suggestion seems to be that the guy, the character, he doesn't have a name here, but the underground man, is actually not so different from us, from you, right? You want him to be, because you sit down and you start listening to him and he's like, I'm a jerk, I think I'm sick, I'm probably an alcoholic or whatever, and you're like, yo, lay off with describing, this doesn't, I don't want to sit with this guy, You want to put distance between yourself and him. You want to be at least I'm not this bad. But by the end of the story, as bad as he is, you start to realize, oh, I'm not that different from this guy. I'll talk more about that next time, but that's just to give you a preview of where I think the story is going, and maybe that'll help sort of tune you into what I say today here. So the wickedness that he describes, that he says makes him not want to get treated, this is really more of a sickness. And he sees it that way. He sees it as a product of the society, or a side effect, or a symptom of being in the society in which he lives. It's not a perennial thing in his mind. This is distinct to Russia in the 1860s, or that kind of a culture. He is impinged upon by that civilization. That's the way he sees it. He says, I was never able to become wicked. And he even admits, quote, I never even managed to become anything, neither wicked nor good, neither a scoundrel nor an honest man, neither a hero nor an insect. And this, of course, is the problem, right? And so as he begins chapter 2, he says, to be overly conscious is a sickness, a real thorough sickness. So something's going on here with the situation, the civilization he's in, and so on, and this problem of being overly conscious. Although later I think he even says being conscious at all is something like a sickness or a problem. So the element in all this that seems so distinctly Dostoevskian to me is precisely this added layer of extreme, hyper, self-conscious navel-gazing all the way through. Whenever you want to make a judgment on this guy, he blurts out that he has already made that very judgment against himself. And, in fact, if anything, you should be ashamed it took you so long to reach that conclusion. Don't think he's not aware, And the effect of this is that although he's unlikable, he's also sort of darkly funny, or at least it's kind of funny to read. I feel like a lot of you that I've contacted who listen to this podcast would get this. There's too much, you're in your head too much, right? It's hard to get out of that space. And this for Dostoevsky is a very modern symptom And it seems to come from, being crowded in these cities and having these bureaucratic, meaningless jobs and being unable to sort of socialize in normal ways and so on. What does all this self-consciousness get the underground man? Like, what's the reward for it? Nothing at all. Like, worse than nothing. He becomes impotent, like incapable of action. He compares himself to men of action, he calls them, with strong nerves. And these men, he says, can accept it when they run up against what he calls a stone wall, a hard, dead end, a limit of sorts. But he, the underground man, with his, surplus of consciousness, cannot accept this stuff. It's like he has too much imagination, which gives birth to rebellion. And I think that's a big part of the theme here, that at least that I'm interested in Dostoevsky in general, like in Demons in particular, but in Notes from the Underground also. Listen to this part. He says, in the face of some mishaps, for example, these gentlemen may bellow at the top of their lungs like bulls, and let's suppose this brings them the greatest honor. But still, as I've already said, they instantly resign themselves before impossibility. Impossibility, meaning a stone wall? What stone wall? Well, of course, the laws of nature, the conclusions of natural science, mathematics. Once it's proved to you, for example, that you are descended from an ape, there's no use making a wry face. Just take it for what it is. Once it's proved to you that, essentially speaking, one little drop of your own fat should be dearer to you than 100,000 of your fellow men, and that in this result all so-called virtues and obligations and other ravings and prejudices will finally be resolved, go ahead and accept it. There's nothing to be done, because 2 times 2 is mathematics. Try objecting to that. End quote. Now, what's he doing there? He's saying that there are these men, the men of action, the men of good nerves, whatever, who can accept limits. They accept it when math or science tells them do this, do that. They just go, okay, like this is, nature or something. Oh, you're descended from an ape? Well, okay, drink enough water, get enough sleep, and so on, right? I mean, it's interesting that he sort of incorporates this Darwinist thing, right? Like, I think this is only written 5 years after the thing about the species, the origin of the species or whatever. But anyway, consider who he's addressing here, the underground man. Who is he talking to? He's not quite writing for a general audience. He's thinking more specifically of a particular kind of person, a particular crowd, and he calls them gentlemen. They seem to be slightly higher class than he is, like socially, but he thinks they aren't as conscious. So, after that crazy paragraph about accepting that 2 times 2 is 4, he immediately gives this gentleman reader a voice. He starts to perform, he sort of talks in their voice. Okay, so listen to how that goes. Quote, "For pity's sake," they'll shout at you, "you can't rebel. It's 2 times 2 is 4. Nature doesn't ask your permission. It doesn't care about your wishes, or whether you like its laws or not. You're obliged to accept it as it is, and consequently all its results as well. And so a wall is indeed a wall," etc., etc. And then the underground man goes back to his own voice and kind of rejoins. He says, "My God, but what do I care about the laws of nature and arithmetic, if for some reason these laws and 2 times 2 is 4 are not to my liking?" Ha! I mean, ha! What a question. What a great insight, right? This is the main image of the first part of Notes from the Underground. 2 times 2 is 4, which is also like a stone wall, and it suggests just, the laws of nature or like hard limits. Okay, so what is it about the laws of nature that are so objectionable to this guy? Well, let me tell you, gentlemen. I mean, you should know if you're a modern, if you're a true, man of the modern era. Look, I'm talking to you, reader, gentlemen. You live in the most modern period in history, right? The scientists have calculated all of it. How many calories you need in a day, how many hours of sleep, how much exercise per week, how often you should go to the dentist, get your eyes checked, sleep with your wife, get a prostate exam. It's all science, right, gentlemen? Can't argue with that. So, eat your glop on schedule, get your 7.5 hours of sleep a night, do your 4 scheduled walks per week, open your mouth and say twice a year, and, bend over for science. You can't object to that. It's science. So, I hope you're feeling me here. I hope you're with me on this. But so what's his reply to all of this very scientific, simply common sense criticism? After all, why won't you take the corona vaccine? What's your problem? Are you special? Wear the mask. It's scientific. You're not a science denier, are you? The experts have said so. What do you find upsetting about all this, citizen? Okay, so that's kind of I hope that's the background for what he's doing in part 1 here. Let me just read you a little chunk here. So chapter 7 in part 1 is probably my favorite. It's where he gives you a good understanding of kind of what's going on in his head about why he doesn't want to comply. He says, "But these are all golden dreams. Oh, tell me, who first announced? Who was the first to proclaim that man does dirty only because he doesn't know his real interests? And that were he to be enlightened, were his eyes to be opened to his real normal interests, man would immediately stop doing dirty, would immediately become good and noble, because being enlightened and understanding his real profit, he would see his real profit precisely in the good, and it's common knowledge that no man can act knowingly against his own profit. Consequently, out of necessity, so to speak, he would start doing good." Oh, the babe! Oh, the pure innocent child! And when was it, to begin with, in all these thousands of years, that man acted solely for his own profit? What is to be done with the millions of facts testifying to how people knowingly, that is, fully understanding their real profit, would put it in second place and throw themselves onto another path, a risk, a perchance, not compelled by anyone or anything, but precisely as if they simply did not want the designated path, and stubbornly, willfully pushed off onto another one, difficult, absurd, searching for it all, but in the dark. So then, this stubbornness and willfulness were really more agreeable to them than any profit. Man, that's so good. The point here is, and people do say this. Very many people say this. Most modern people think this, and especially, sort of secular materialist utopian liberals. They think the only problems in the world are a problem of education. We just need to educate the next generation a little better, and then it'll all be good, right? Like that'll fix everything, okay? But he knows he hasn't convinced these gentlemen scientists yet, these, right-minded people. And so he keeps talking to them, trying desperately to show them that he understands them better than they understand him. He says, quote, you, gentlemen, you are perfectly confident that man will not fail to grow accustomed once 1 or 2 old bad habits have passed, and once common sense and science have thoroughly re-educated and given a normal direction to human nature. You are confident that man will then voluntarily cease making mistakes, and willy-nilly, so to speak, refuse to set his will at variance with his normal interests. Moreover, then you say, science itself will teach man, though this is really a luxury in my opinion, that in fact he has neither will nor caprice, and never did have any, and that he himself is nothing but a sort of piano key or spring in an organ, and that, furthermore, there also exist in the world the laws of nature, so that whatever he does is done not at all according to his own wanting, but of itself, according to the laws of nature. Consequently, these laws of nature need only be discovered, or taught. And then man will no longer be answerable for his actions, and his life will become extremely easy. Needless to say, all human actions will then be calculated according to these laws, mathematically, like a table of logarithms, up to 108,000, and entered into a calendar. Everything will be so precisely calculated and designated that there will no longer be any actions or adventures in the world. And it is then, this is still you speaking, gentlemen, that new economic relations will come, quite ready-made, and also calculated with mathematical precision, so that all possible questions will vanish in an instant, essentially because they will have been given all possible answers. Then the Crystal Palace will be built. End quote. I love this guy's sarcasm. That's what it is. It's like sarcasm, right? It's so modern sounding. Okay, so I pray that you understand him here. He's making such a powerful point. In short, there is something dearer to us than the laws of nature, dearer to us than even our own scientifically calculated well-being. And what is it? It's will, basically. Our own freedom to choose, to have whims, to be without reason, to be without reason. Listen to this little part of an interview with Duncan, Trussell, and the infamous Douglas Rushkoff.
It's like, I'm going to let Morning Joe program me. And, and it's this sense, that's why I wrote this other book, Program or Be Programmed, which is kind of about that in a digital age, your media programs you, and then your behaviors and your attitudes. It's like it's not that the algorithms are going to get us. It's that we are treating ourselves like algorithms, not like human beings.
Wow.
So we get certain programming, and then, and the way I'm judging if it's a good program or not is, does it make the person hard and ideological, or does it make them soft and squishy and open? Like,
that part at the end is so, you got to be careful with that, right? Because everything Douglas Rushkoff said up to then, totally true. And the Underground Man would have agreed with him. We are treating ourselves like algorithms. We are programming ourselves as if we are piano keys, to use the Underground Man's language. But notice that Rushkoff, I just want you to notice this, the infamous Douglas Rushkoff, you can look him up on YouTube. He wants to throw in that stuff there at the end about, is the program making you soft and squishy and open? And if so, that's a good program. Well, wait a minute, Douglas Rushkoff. Really? Who says so? You know what I mean? That is not a foregone conclusion. That part is not science. That's him wanting a certain outcome in the world because, I don't know, maybe it'll make life easier for him to be in a civilization of soft men who are open to everything or whatever. But no, that part of it, definitely not scientific, right? So there's always this sort of poison pill slipped in with the science, it seems, or very often. Okay, so what's the conclusion to all of this resistance, or this insistence on having will, right? The Underground Man says, I agree that 2 times 2 is 4 is an excellent thing. But if we're going to start praising everything, then 2 times 2 is 5 is sometimes also a most charming little thing. Isn't that, what a madman. I love it, right? Because this is kind of like pushing back on modernity and science and realism and stuff with a dose of Romans 7, romanticism. Edgar Allan Poe's Imp of the Perverse. We'll talk more about this in future episodes. But basically, human whim. You know what I mean? Feelings. These aren't rational, but they're real. And they're more precious to us than the scientific tables. Have you heard of the Crystal Palace, by the way? It's a reference to Nikolai Chernyshevsky's famous, at least in Russia, book called What Is to Be Done. In the book, there's a crystal palace, which sort of represents the ideal living space for the future utopian communist society. It's all based on Fourier's phalanx stuff, the phalanstery. And the palace itself was probably based on the cast iron and glass pavilion that was constructed for the very modern and optimistic London Exposition of 1851. In other words, it signifies utopia. And we're so close to it now, aren't we, guys? We're so close to utopia. If only everyone would pay their taxes, get their annual health checkups, wear their masks, get vaccinated, socially distance, not eat too much meat, or drive too much, or fly, and always cough into your elbow. Don't shake hands. But if we all did that stuff, and, invented a machine to clean plastic out of the ocean, and there are a few other details we need to work out, but it's all just technology. We just need to quite figure it out. If we could just get all that into place, then we would build the Crystal Palace and be happy forever. And this is what the, statist planner types, the utopians, the post-left or whatever, they all sort of want to believe that if we just get the policies right, then the Crystal Palace will be built and it'll all be good. But what Dostoevsky is doing here is he is saying no. Like, he is dropping the black paint back into the barrel of white paint, and now it's not white anymore. And that black drop of paint is sin, or whim, or like just human nature itself, which always demands something that's more important to it than its own freedom. There's an article in the New York Times from about 2010, I remember, called, the title of the article was, "Told to Eat Its Vegetables, America Orders French Fries." And it's such a condescending New York Times article. Like we told you to eat vegetables, Americans. Why do you keep eating French fries? And this is such a great question, actually. Why do you? Why do you eat that crap? Why do you eat, ice cream sometimes? It's just bad for you. Why do you indulge and why does my wife like to, at the end of the week, turn on a show that she knows is garbage for herself, rather than watch an educational documentary or something? She knows it's bad for her, right? It's certainly not good for her. But there's something about it. It's who cares? It's almost perverse. It's almost self-destructive in a way. It's I know there's better things, better choices I could make, but I'm doing this almost to prove to myself that I have agency or choice or something, right? By the way, whoever among ye raises me a meme of Dostoevsky as a cartoon, profile view saying no, doesn't have to sign up for Patreon this month. Because if you can picture that in your heads right now, the meme version of Dostoevsky saying no with a period, picture that, against all this optimism and utopianism and the lean-in progressive narratives. Just picture Dostoevsky saying no, okay? And what is his primary objection to it, if asked? You know what it is? It's, I don't want to. That's it. I don't want to. Or as Bartleby, Melville's Bartleby in America phrases it about 10 years earlier than this, slightly more memorably too, I have to say. I would prefer not to, right? We can do an episode on Bartleby here down the line eventually, one of my faves. So he begins I'm talking about the Underground Man now, he begins chapter 11 of part 1, which is the last chapter in part 1, with an exclamation, a sort of a solution to being asked to, behave in his own self-interest. By the way, before I read it to you, just part of what you have to keep in mind is that Dostoevsky seems to have been reacting to some of the sort of dominant discourse about economic theory during his age, right? It's all Adam Smithy stuff, which is the economists believed that that people act in their own self-interest. And so in some sense what they had done is to elide or remove from the conversation the problem of sin or of self-destruction or of perverseness. They couldn't understand why would anyone, like get addicted to eating Coke or drinking Coke Classic when they could drink something much healthier like sparkling water. In the minds of the economists, this was all kind of irrational. But Dostoevsky started to understand that like the irrational can be appealed to in this crazy consumerist, capitalist, modern situation. And so people can get themselves in trouble. So what's his objection here? And it's sort of phrased all at once at the beginning of chapter 11. He says, "The final end, gentlemen, better to do nothing. Better conscious inertia. And so, long live the underground." That's it. Do you guys, my listeners, and I think I have a girl listener now, by the way, so hello, madam. But do you get what this is? Do you get it? Like, what is this? The image I just read to you, the final end, gentlemen. That is to say, like, what conclusion have we reached, gentlemen, after talking about all this science and my resistance to it and stuff? Better to do nothing. That is, better to do nothing than to daily go through this, like, required routine, this scientifically prescribed routine. Better to do nothing. Better conscious inertia. In other words, so who is this guy? Picture him. I think you know who this is. This is the basement-dwelling incel guy, right? What's his name? Wojak. The video game-playing, YouTube-watching onanist. But listen, this is not just any basement-dwelling, video game-playing, YouTube-watching incel onanist. This is a conscious one. A conscious one. He's conscious. What does that mean? It means he's in his mom's basement playing video games and stuff, but only because there's more dignity there than there would be getting a prostate exam or getting an annual COVID vaccine in order to be allowed to hold a job in a cubicle in some bureaucracy somewhere. Isn't that amazing? I love that. I love it. It's so amazing. Now, is that actually better? I mean, pull out of the story for a minute. Is he actually any better than anybody else? I don't know. Like, probably not. But it's so fun that he thinks he's better that, like, he's like, I'm not just a loser. I'm a loser, like, self-consciously. You see? That's a different thing, he sort of says. And he basically convinces me as I read it. I think he's so funny and interesting. He then kind of wavers at the end of chapter 11 with this stuff about how, like, he's like very defensive all the time because he doesn't want the judgment of these gentlemen. And so he says, basically, he says, in every man's memories, there are such things as he will not reveal to everyone, but perhaps only to friends. There are also such as he will reveal not even to friends, but only to himself, and that in secret. Then, finally, there are such as a man is afraid to reveal even to himself. And every decent man will have accumulated quite a few things of this sort. That is, one might even say, the more decent a man is, the more of them he will have. Skipping a little bit, he says, is it possible to be perfectly candid with oneself and not be afraid of the whole truth? And a little further down, he says, I, however, am writing only for myself. I do not want to hamper myself with anything in preparing my notes. I will not introduce any order or system. Whatever I recall, I will write down. Now, for example, someone might seize upon a word and ask me, if you really are not counting on any readers, why then do you make such agreements with yourself, and on paper, besides, that you will introduce no order or system? that you will write down whatever you recall, etc., etc. Why these explanations? Why these apologies? Well, so it goes, I reply. In other words, you see what he's doing, right? The gentlemen are trying to capture him, and he goes, no, basically. He says, there is, however, a whole psychology here. Maybe it's also that I'm simply a coward, and maybe also that I'm purposely imagining a public before me so as to behave more decently while I write. There may be 1,000 reasons. But here's another thing. For what, and to what end, in fact, do I want to write? If not for the public, then why not simply recall everything mentally without transferring it to paper? Right, sir. But on paper, it will somehow come out more solemnly. There's something imposing in it. There will be more of a judgment on oneself. It will gain in style. Besides, maybe I will indeed get relief from the writing. Today, for example, I'm particularly oppressed by one distant recollection. I recalled it clearly the other day, and it has since stayed with me like a nagging musical tune that refuses to be gotten rid of. And yet one must get rid of it. I have hundreds of such recollections, but some one out of 100 emerges every now and then and oppresses me. I believe, for some reason, that if I write it down, I shall then be rid of it. So why not try? And finally, I'm bored, and I constantly do nothing, and writing things down really seems like work. They say work makes a man good and honest. Well, there's a chance at least. Snow is falling today, almost wet, yellow, dull. And it was falling yesterday, and it was falling the other day as well. I think it was apropos of the wet snow that I recalled this anecdote that now refuses to be gotten rid of. And so, let this be a story apropos of the wet snow. End part 1. Okay, so what he's going to tell you in part 2 is that memory from a long time ago, from when he was 24, and somehow it's apropos of the wet snow, and it also, of course, is some sort of an explanation for, like, why he is the way he is at age 40, okay? Like I said, the main takeaway from part 1 here, told to eat its vegetables, America orders French fries, and the narrator here is like, yes, French fries sometimes. Or a lot of you will remember the stuff about Cass Sunstein's book, Nudge, Richard Thaler, that whole thing about nudging people. It's so manipulative, and they always passed it off as like scientific, and it's like, it's good for you though. I mean, what harm is it if we put the healthy food here and the unhealthy food up there, or we put a little sticker of a bumblebee in the urinal, But it's like, I don't want to be controlled like that all the time. I don't want to be constantly nudged. Stop fucking nudging me, Like, that's the attitude that this underground man expresses, and I think does so effectively and so fun. I think that's all I've got for this one. You guys know the routine at the end. Here's the outro music.